The incident that changed everything. It was a crisp autumn evening when Alicia Morgan, a young black woman in her late 20s, navigated the quiet streets of Greenridge, a suburban area she'd called home for nearly 5 years. The day had been long, filled with meetings and deadlines at the nonprofit organization where she worked as a community liaison. Exhausted but content, she relished the thought of unwinding in her cozy apartment with a book and a cup of tea. The faint hum of her car's engine filled the silence as she cruised down the tree-lined streets, the golden hues of fall reflecting off her windshield. Just as she approached a stop sign near her neighborhood, flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank. She wasn't speeding, hadn't skipped the stop sign, and her car registration was up to date. The unease in her chest grew as she pulled over to the side of the road. Taking a deep breath, Alicia rolled down her window as the police officer approached. He was a stocky man in his 40s, with a stern face and a rigid posture. His badge read Officer Grayson. Something about his demeanor instantly set her on edge. "License and registration," he said curtly, not even glancing at her before staring intently at her car's interior. "Good evening, officer," Alicia replied, forcing herself to remain calm. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Grayson's eyes finally met hers, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Just hand over your license and registration, man," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. Alicia complied, retrieving her documents from her purse and glove compartment. As she handed them over, she noticed the officer's gaze linger on her face before scanning her attire, a professional blazer and blouse. The scrutiny in his expression made her skin crawl. "Why are you driving around here this late?" he asked, flipping through her documents with deliberate slowness. "I live here," Alicia responded evenly, though her grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Is there a problem?" "Funny," he said, smirking as he leaned against her car door. "Don't see many people like you in this neighborhood." Her stomach churned at the implication. People like you. She knew exactly what he meant, but she chose not to take the bait. Instead, she maintained her composure. "As I said, officer, I live here. If I've done something wrong, please let me know." Grayson straightened, crossing his arms as he studied her. "How long have you lived here?" 5 years, she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions building within her. She refused to let him see her anger or fear. Grayson let out a low whistle, shaking his head as if in disbelief. 5 years, huh? Guess the neighborhood standards are dropping. The blatant insult hit her like a slap in the face, but Alicia bit her tongue. She'd dealt with prejudice before, but something about this encounter felt more personal, more invasive. She could sense his intent to provoke her, to push her into reacting in a way that would justify his actions. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, officer," she said calmly, though her heart pounded in her chest. Ignoring her, Grayson began circling her car, his flashlight sweeping over the vehicle. He tapped on the trunk, peered into the backseat, and muttered something under his breath that Alicia couldn't catch. "This your car?" he asked abruptly, turning back to face her. "Yes," she said. "It's registered in my name." He raised an eyebrow. "Nice car. Doesn't seem like the kind of ride someone in your line of work could afford." Alicia's jaw clenched. The veiled accusation was clear. Before she could respond, Grayson's radio crackled, and a voice informed him of a nearby disturbance. He reached for the device, replying curtly before turning back to her. "Stay put," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Alicia watched as he walked back to his patrol car, her mind racing. The injustice of the situation weighed heavily on her, but she knew better than to let her emotions take control. Her parents had drilled into her the importance of staying calm and respectful during encounters with law enforcement, no matter how unjust they seemed. Still, a part of her seethed with anger. Why should she have to endure this? Why was her presence in her own neighborhood being questioned? Minutes ticked by as she sat in her car, waiting. The street was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, but she didn't dare reach for it, fearing that any sudden movement might escalate the situation. Finally, Grayson returned, his expression darker than before. "Step out of the car," he commanded. Her pulse quickened. "Why? Am I under arrest?" "I said step out of the car," he repeated, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. Alicia hesitated, fear and anger warring within her. Reluctantly, she opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, the cool night air chilling her skin. Grayson immediately moved closer, invading her personal space. "Turn around," he said, hands on the car. "What's this about?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. "I said, hands on the car," he barked, his tone brooking no argument. Alicia complied, her mind reeling. She hadn't done anything wrong. This wasn't a routine stop. This was harassment, plain and simple. As Grayson began patting her down, she felt a mix of humiliation and fury. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she knew it would only make things worse. The sound of an approaching car broke the tense silence. Headlights illuminated the scene, and Alicia turned her head just enough to see a sleek black sedan pulling up behind a patrol car. The vehicle came to a stop, and the driver's door opened. A tall man in a tailored suit stepped out, his commanding presence immediately drawing attention. "Officer Grayson," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Grayson stiffened, his hand dropping from Alicia's shoulder as he turned to face the newcomer. "Just conducting a routine stop, sir," he said, though his tone lacked its earlier bravado. The man's gaze shifted to Alicia, his expression unreadable. "Routine stop? Is that what this is?" "Yes, sir," Grayson replied quickly. The driver seemed suspicious. "Suspicious?" the man repeated, raising an eyebrow. He stepped closer, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Do you know who this is?" Grayson faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "No, sir. Should I?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is Alicia Morgan, my daughter." Grayson's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form a response. Alicia, still leaning against her car, felt a surge of vindication. For the first time that night, the balance of power shifted, and it wasn't in Grayson's favor. The power of truth. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Alicia straightened slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears as the tension between the two men thickened. Officer Grayson's confident facade had crumbled, leaving a pale, visibly shaken man in its place. The weight of the commissioner's words hung in the air, undeniable in their impact. "Your daughter," Grayson stammered, his voice barely audible. His hand twitched, moving instinctively to the brim of his hat as though it might shield him from the commissioner's piercing gaze. "Sir, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't," Commissioner Leonard Morgan interrupted, his voice sharp and unforgiving. He took a step closer, his imposing figure towering over Grayson. "That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't bother to know. You saw a black woman in a nice car and decided she didn't belong. Is that how you justify your actions?" Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He glanced at Alicia, then back at the commissioner, his expression pleading, as if hoping for mercy. None came. "I expect answers," Leonard continued, his tone icy. "What exactly made you think she was suspicious? Was she speeding? Driving recklessly? What offense did she commit?" Grayson looked down at his boots, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She didn't commit any offense, sir. I thought." "You thought?" Leonard cut him off, his voice rising. "That's all you've done tonight, officer. You thought. But what you thought was tainted by your bias. You didn't stop her for any legitimate reason. You stopped her because of your assumptions. Isn't that correct?" Grayson's silence was all the confirmation Leonard needed. He turned to Alicia, his stern expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Alicia hesitated, the rush of emotions making it hard to find her voice. Relief, anger, and humiliation collided within her, creating a storm she could barely contain. "I'm fine," she managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But this wasn't just a misunderstanding, Dad. He treated me like a criminal for no reason." Leonard nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, and it's unacceptable." Turning back to Grayson, Leonard's demeanor hardened once more. "You're done here, officer. Hand over your badge and gun. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full investigation." Grayson's face turned ashen. "Suspended? Sir, please. Don't waste your breath," Leonard snapped. "Your actions tonight speak for themselves." Grayson fumbled with his holster, his hands shaking as he unclipped his badge and weapon. He placed them on the hood of Alicia's car, his movements mechanical, as though he couldn't believe what was happening. "This isn't the end for you," Leonard continued, his voice cold. "There will be consequences, Grayson. Not just for you, but for anyone in this department who thinks they can act with impunity. Your behavior is a stain on this badge, and I won't allow it to go unchecked." Grayson's shoulders slumped as he backed away, his expression a mixture of anger and shame. Without another word, he turned and walked toward his patrol car, his head bowed. Moments later, the vehicle pulled away, leaving Leonard and Alicia alone under the dim glow of a nearby streetlight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Leonard's expression remained stern, but there was a hint of vulnerability in his eyes as he looked at his daughter. "I'm sorry this happened, Alicia," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "I failed you tonight. As a father, and as a leader." Alicia shook her head, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "This isn't your fault, Dad. This is about him and everyone like him. It's about the system that allows this kind of behavior to exist in the first place." Leonard sighed, running a hand over his face. "You're right, but that doesn't make it any easier to accept. I've spent my career trying to root out this kind of prejudice, and yet it still finds its way into my department." Alicia stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not just your department, Dad. It's everywhere. And it's going to take more than one man to change it." Leonard nodded, his eyes clouded with guilt. "We'll start with him. But I need your help, Alicia. This can't just be swept under the rug. We have to shine a light on it, no matter how uncomfortable it gets." Alicia hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew he was right, but the thought of stepping into the spotlight, of exposing her experience to public scrutiny, was daunting. Still, she couldn't deny the importance of what he was asking. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice firm. "But we can't stop at just him. This has to be about the bigger picture." Leonard's expression softened, a flicker of pride shining through his weariness. "You're stronger than I ever realized," he said quietly. As they stood together in the cool night air, Alicia felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her or her father. It was about the countless others who had faced similar injustices without anyone to stand up for them. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to fight. Little did she know, the challenges she would face in the coming days would test her resolve in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The story of that night would ignite a firestorm, drawing attention from all corners of the city and beyond. And as the truth came to light, Alicia would find herself at the center of a movement that could change everything. The unraveling. The next few days felt like a blur, each moment heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. What had started as a single incident, a seemingly routine traffic stop, had quickly transformed into something much bigger. The media had caught wind of it, and within hours, Alicia's name was all over the news. The story of the police officer who had harassed her on a quiet evening was now a national headline, and her father's position as the commissioner added a layer of complexity she had never anticipated. Alicia had always tried to avoid the spotlight. She was a private person, focused on her work in community advocacy and social justice, quietly fighting for change without seeking attention. But now, the spotlight had found her. She couldn't turn it off, no matter how much she wished she could. The messages began pouring in, some supportive, others hostile. People she barely knew reached out, offering their sympathy or demanding answers. At first, she was overwhelmed by the flood of attention. Her phone constantly buzzed, and her inbox was filled with both messages of encouragement and angry tirades. But it was the anonymous messages that unnerved her, each one more threatening than the last. "You'll regret this. You think you've won. Watch your back, Morgan. You're just another token. Your father can't protect you forever." Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was lurking just beneath the surface. The phone calls late at night, the vague threats. She'd lived in this city long enough to know that these were not idle words. They were the kind of messages that preceded something worse, the kind of threat that didn't just go away. And now that her father had become embroiled in the scandal, she could feel the eyes of the city on them, watching, waiting. She spent the next few days at home, trying to process everything that had happened. Her father, ever the dutiful commissioner, was consumed with meetings, interviews, and dealing with the fallout of Officer Grayson's actions. Alicia knew he was doing everything he could to make sure this wouldn't be swept under the rug, but she could see the toll it was taking on him. He hadn't slept much since the incident, and his usual calm demeanor was fraying at the edges. On the third day after the stop, the tension in the house had reached a boiling point. Leonard had been working tirelessly to coordinate the investigation into Officer Grayson, pushing for a swift resolution. But the political pressure was mounting. The city council members, the police union, even local media outlets, all were weighing in, demanding answers, each group with their own agenda. Alicia sat at the kitchen table, staring at the latest news clip about the incident. She had agreed to speak with reporters, hoping to keep the conversation focused on the systemic issues of racial profiling. But the angle the media had taken felt more like a circus. Some outlets had latched onto her father's involvement, suggesting that his connection to the incident might have skewed the facts. Others had twisted her words, turning her into a symbol of both victimhood and privilege. The contradictions were maddening. But it wasn't the media coverage that bothered her the most. It was the undercurrent of fear that had begun to seep into her thoughts. She had always known the world was unfair, but this was different. The injustice wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It was real, and it was personal. That evening, as Alicia prepared herself for yet another round of interviews, her father walked into the kitchen. His face was haggard, his eyes weary. He hadn't shaved in days, and the weight of responsibility had aged him in the short time since the incident. "Alicia," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, her heart sinking. "What is it?" "The investigation into Grayson is moving forward, but the pressure's only going to increase. There's already talk of protests, rallies in the streets, people demanding action. I've never seen the department this divided before." She leaned back in her chair, absorbing his words. "What does that mean for us? For you?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly to the window, as if looking for some kind of answer from the outside world. "It means that everything is about to change. There are factions in the department, Alicia. Some of them want to bury this, make it go away quietly. Others want to see Grayson punished, but they don't want the system to be held accountable. And then there are the ones who want to make a statement, publicly. But none of it addresses the real issue." Alicia could feel the frustration rising within her. "And what's the real issue, Dad? You know what's going on. This isn't just about Grayson. This is about the culture, the bias that runs deep in the department, and in society." Her father's face hardened, and he placed his hands on the table. "I know that, sweetheart. But the system is a beast, and sometimes it feels like no matter what I do, I can't change it." Alicia's breath hitched, and she stood up, her hands trembling. "That's not good enough, Dad. It's not just about one officer or even just the department. It's about the entire system. We need to demand accountability from every corner. Law enforcement, the courts, the politicians. They all need to know that we're not backing down. He looked at her with a mixture of pride and pain in his eyes. I know you're right, but this won't be easy, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. Alicia turned toward the window, staring out into the quiet suburban streets. The sound of distant cars passing by seemed so foreign to her now, like the world was moving on while she was stuck in a battle she hadn't asked for. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't walk away from it. The next morning, the situation took an unexpected turn. While Alicia had been preparing for yet another round of interviews, her father called her into his office. He looked more tired than ever, but his expression was focused, his tone urgent. "Alicia, we have a problem," he said, motioning for her to sit. "The investigation is getting complicated. There's more to Officer Grayson's past than we realized." Alicia frowned, her heart sinking. "What do you mean?" Leonard leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him. "We've uncovered some troubling things. Personal complaints, a history of allegations against him that were never properly addressed. But there's something else. It seems that Grayson was involved in a larger network of officers who've been linked to questionable activities, and they've been operating in the shadows for years. This isn't just one bad apple, Alicia. It's an entire culture of corruption." Alicia's mind raced. She had known that racism in the police force wasn't just an isolated issue, but the realization that it ran deeper, that it had roots in the very foundation of law enforcement, shook her to the core. "So what happens now? What can we do about it?" Her father looked at her with a mix of resolve and uncertainty. "This is bigger than anything we've faced before. If we go public with this, if we expose the corruption, it could tear the department apart. It could ruin the careers of officers who may have been involved, and it will put us directly in the line of fire from everyone in power who wants to keep this quiet." Alicia swallowed hard. "And if we don't go public? If we don't expose it?" Her father's expression hardened. "Then we allow this to continue. We let it fester until it's even worse than it is now, and we betray the people who need us the most." She could see the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about a single officer anymore. This was about an institution, an entire system of power that had allowed these abuses to happen for years without any real oversight. It was a fight that couldn't be won quietly, and it would cost them everything. Alicia stood up, her resolve hardening. "Then we go public. We make sure the truth comes out. No more hiding." Her father nodded, his eyes full of pride and fear. "I'm with you, Alicia. But be ready. Once this story breaks, there's no turning back." The unseen enemy. The days following the decision to go public were a whirlwind of activity. Alicia had never imagined that one action, one decision to stand up for what was right, would change the trajectory of her life in such a profound way. Her father, Commissioner Leonard Morgan, had given her the option to step back, to let the department handle the investigation quietly. But Alicia knew that silence would only perpetuate the system of abuse. If things were going to change, it had to be done openly, publicly, with full transparency. The press conference was scheduled for the following week. The story had already hit the airwaves, and the pressure from both the public and the media had been unrelenting. In the days before, Alicia had been living in a fog of both determination and fear. She'd been preparing herself for the onslaught that would inevitably come. Endless interviews, social media backlash, and more threats that only served to reinforce her resolve. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the sense that something darker was unfolding just beneath the surface. Alicia sat at her desk late one evening, reviewing a list of questions reporters were expected to ask. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the table, filled with messages and calls from friends, family, and strangers who either supported her or criticized her for bringing shame to the police force. Despite the mounting pressure, she focused intently on the upcoming press conference. She was determined to be calm, composed, and unwavering in the face of the scrutiny that awaited her. As she skimmed over the list of questions, a notification popped up on her phone. It was an email from an unknown address. She clicked it open, her eyes scanning the message with growing unease. "You think you've won, don't you? You're only scratching the surface. Your father may be in charge, but we have eyes everywhere. Don't think your actions will go unnoticed. The truth is more dangerous than you know. Watch your back. Always." Alicia's heart skipped a beat. The anonymity of the message sent chills down her spine. It was one thing to be confronted by prejudice, even direct harassment, but this was different. This was a veiled threat. And it made her realize that the fight she was facing wasn't just against Officer Grayson or even the department. It was against a network of corruption that was much more widespread than she could have imagined. She quickly forwarded the email to her father, her fingers shaking as she typed a brief message. "Dad, we're not just dealing with isolated incidents. There's something bigger going on." Leonard replied almost immediately. "I'll have my team look into it. Stay vigilant. This is just the beginning." But Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that the message was just the tip of the iceberg. Whoever had sent it knew too much, and the subtle tone of the threat suggested that they had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. As the hours passed, she struggled to focus, her mind consumed by the email's cryptic words. She knew she had to prepare herself, not just for the media firestorm, but for something far more dangerous. The following morning, as Alicia was preparing for a scheduled meeting with reporters, her phone buzzed again. It was a text this time, from an unknown number. "We're watching you, Morgan. Don't think you can hide behind your father's badge forever. We know what you're really after." A sinking feeling gripped her chest. Someone was watching her, and they weren't just threatening her. They were warning her that she was crossing a line. This wasn't just about race, or even about justice. It was about something much deeper, something that was far more ingrained in the power structures that controlled the city. Alicia felt a growing sense of urgency. She couldn't afford to be complacent. Whoever was behind these messages wasn't just trying to intimidate her. They were sending a clear message that they would do anything to stop her from speaking the truth. The day of the press conference arrived with the weight of 1,000 expectations. Alicia stood before a sea of reporters, cameras flashing and microphones thrust in her face. Her father stood beside her, his stern expression betraying the tension he felt inside. This wasn't just a press conference, it was a statement, a declaration that they were no longer going to tolerate the injustices that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The first few questions were routine. The reporters wanted to know about her experience with Officer Grayson, her feelings on the investigation, and what steps the department was taking to address the issue of racial profiling. Alicia answered each question carefully, maintaining a calm exterior, but inside, she was bracing herself for the inevitable questions that would challenge her resolve. And then, just as she had anticipated, a reporter stood up and asked the question that would change everything. "Commissioner Morgan, given the recent developments with your daughter's encounter with Officer Grayson, do you believe this is an isolated incident, or is there a larger issue within your department that needs to be addressed? And how do you respond to the accusation that your position of power has influenced the investigation?" The question hung in the air like a weight, the entire room holding its breath. Alicia could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, the pressure mounting with each passing second. This wasn't just about her father's reputation. It was about the integrity of the entire department. The implications were enormous. Her father didn't flinch. He responded quickly and decisively, his voice firm. "What happened with my daughter was wrong. Officer Grayson's actions were inexcusable, and we are taking every step to ensure that such behavior will not be tolerated in the future. However, I want to be clear. This issue is not limited to one officer. It is systemic. There are deeper problems within our department that have been allowed to persist for far too long. And as commissioner, I take full responsibility for that." The room erupted in a flurry of questions, but Alicia barely heard them. Her thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by the looming threat that had followed her every step. She glanced nervously at her phone. wondering if she would receive another ominous message. But to her surprise, there was silence. It was as though the world had paused, holding its breath to see what would happen next. Just as she thought she could breathe again, another reporter stood up, holding a piece of paper in his hand. "Commissioner Morgan, this is a follow-up question. We've just received some disturbing information regarding a group of officers within your department who are allegedly involved in a covert network of corruption. We're told that this group has been operating in the shadows for years, influencing investigations and covering up misconduct. Can you speak to this?" The room fell into stunned silence. Alicia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched her father's expression shift from calm to something unreadable. He had known that this moment was coming, but the magnitude of the accusation hit like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, his face hardening as he addressed the question. "I can confirm that an internal investigation is underway. We are taking this very seriously. If any officers are found to be involved in misconduct, they will be held accountable. No one is above the law, not even those within the department." The reporters continued to press him for more details, but Alicia could feel the tension in the room. This wasn't just about a rogue officer anymore. The floodgates had opened, and the truth was starting to spill out. Whoever was behind the threats to her had clearly anticipated this moment, and now the real battle was just beginning. As the press conference concluded and the reporters filed out, Alicia felt a sense of dread wash over her. This wasn't just about Officer Grayson anymore. This was a war that had been brewing for years, and now, it seemed as though the whole city was about to erupt. She glanced at her father, who was already deep in conversation with his team, his face drawn with concern. For the first time in her life, Alicia felt the weight of their family name. She had never thought much about the power it carried, until now. And as the door closed behind her, she realized that this was only the beginning. The system that had allowed the corruption to flourish was now on the brink of collapse, and with it, everything she had ever known would be put to the test. The tipping point. The public was ready for answers, and Alicia knew they wouldn't wait forever. The protests had escalated, and the city was on the edge of a breaking point. But as much as the people demanded change, she understood the fragile balance they were walking. If they moved too quickly, if they made one wrong step, the whole thing could implode. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Yet there was no turning back now. Alicia's mind raced. The investigation had gone far beyond what she'd ever imagined. The information she'd just seen made it clear that the corruption was far more pervasive than she could have anticipated, and each revelation only increased the stakes. The system they were fighting wasn't just a few rogue officers. It was an empire of power built over decades. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a well-oiled machine designed to protect its own. With every layer they peeled back, the consequences of their actions became more severe. They had uncovered a deep systemic corruption that stretched from the streets to the city's highest offices, and the people in charge, those who could make or break careers, who controlled the fate of the city's future, had no intention of letting the truth get out. As the hours passed in that dimly lit room, Alicia could feel the gravity of the situation pressing in on her. She'd known she was taking on a massive fight, but this was different. This was war, against the people who had shaped this city for decades, against the system that had been built to keep everything in place. "Ellis," she said, looking directly at him, her voice firm, "we can't wait for someone else to act. We have to expose this now. The people are out there, and they won't stop until they know the truth. If we wait any longer, they'll have won. It's too big to just sweep under the rug." The detective nodded, a mixture of weariness and determination in his eyes. "I know, but you need to be ready. Once this goes public, it's not just the department that'll crumble. Everything we've been working toward, your father's career, the stability of the city, it all comes down to this. The moment we blow the whistle, there's no going back." Alicia clenched her fists. "Then let's make sure we don't go back. We need to expose them all." But as the decision weighed heavily on her, She knew the true scale of their mission. The fight wasn't just about holding one man accountable anymore. It was about toppling a city's power structure. She had become the symbol of resistance, and the battle ahead was only going to get harder. They were up against an invisible, yet powerful enemy, one that had connections far beyond the police department. Ellis stood and walked toward the file on the desk. If we go forward with this, we'll need backup. We need to find allies who are as committed to exposing the truth as we are. We'll need the media on our side. We'll need public figures, and we'll need the law enforcement officers who are still on our side. Alicia thought for a moment, considering the possible allies they could count on. She couldn't afford to trust anyone too high up. Many of them were likely compromised. But there were still good people in the department, officers who were just as disgusted by what had been happening as she was. She needed to find them, and fast. "Leave that to me," she said. "I'll start making calls." As she walked out of the office, Alicia's phone buzzed again. It was a message from her father, simple but urgent. "Meet me at the office. We need to talk." She immediately texted Ellis. "I'll meet you later. I need to speak with my dad first." When she arrived at the commissioner's office, Leonard was already there, pacing with a tense energy. His usually composed demeanor was shattered, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. The weight of the situation had taken a toll on him. He stopped pacing when Alicia entered, his eyes immediately locking onto hers. "Alicia," he said, his voice filled with concern, "I've just been briefed on the latest developments. We're losing support. The mayor's office is backing away, and the pressure from the police union is becoming unbearable. They're playing hardball. If we continue down this road, we'll risk everything. Our department, my career, your safety, it's all on the line." Alicia's stomach tightened, but she refused to back down. "We can't stop, Dad. If we do, nothing will ever change. We've seen what's happening. We've seen the corruption. We can't just let it go. The public deserves the truth." Leonard paused, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and worry. "I agree. But the question is, can we expose it without bringing the whole city down with us? The people behind this are not just going to step aside. They'll fight back, and they'll fight dirty." Alicia looked her father in the eyes, her voice unwavering. "I don't care. We've seen how the system works, and it's broken. We're not just fighting for us anymore. We're fighting for everyone who's been silenced, everyone who's been hurt by this. We can't let them win." Leonard's face softened, and for the first time in days, he smiled at her. "I've never been prouder of you, Alicia, but we need to be smart about this. We can't fight this battle with just our words. We need to arm ourselves with everything we've got. We need to get the media involved. We need to make sure the public is with us. And we need to find those officers who are still on the side of justice. We need them now more than ever." They spent the next few hours strategizing, reaching out to trusted allies, and preparing for the inevitable storm that was about to hit. As they made their plans, Alicia couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. She knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew that the moment they exposed the truth, nothing would ever be the same. Later that night, as Alicia returned to her apartment, she received another message. This one wasn't from an anonymous number. It was from her childhood friend, Sarah, someone she hadn't heard from in years. Her message was short, but it gave Alicia a sense of renewed hope. "We're with you, Alicia. You're not alone. Keep fighting." It was a small gesture, but it was the support she needed to keep going. As she read the message, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself, or even for her father. She was fighting for every person who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or silenced by the system. And that was a fight worth winning. As the weeks stretched on, and the investigation deepened, Alicia and her father stood firm. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were not going to back down. This was their moment to change the course of the city's future, and they would stop at nothing to see it through. The storm was coming, but they were ready. The breaking point. The man who had stepped out of the black SUV was an unfamiliar face, but one that carried the weight of influence in his every movement. His sharp suit and calculated steps spoke volumes. This wasn't a man who appeared without reason. As he approached Leonard and Alicia, the air around them seemed to thicken. The stillness of the night suddenly charged with anticipation. "Mr. Morgan, Miss Morgan," he greeted them with a firm handshake. "My name is Charles Reed. I'm with the mayor's office. We need to talk." Alicia felt her instincts kick in, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. Something about the man's tone, his calculated politeness, rubbed her the wrong way. Her father's expression remained guarded, and Alicia could see the tension in his posture. "We're in the middle of a conversation," Leonard said, his voice steady but firm. "Can this wait until tomorrow?" Reed didn't flinch. "I think it's better if we talk now, before things escalate further. Trust me, you don't want to wait." Alicia exchanged a quick look with her father before nodding slowly. Leonard took a breath, his eyes narrowing slightly as he led Reed to the car, signaling for Alicia to follow. She felt a sinking sensation in her stomach, a knot that had been there ever since the first threats had appeared. She wasn't naive enough to believe this was a friendly conversation. Once they were all seated inside the car, Reed wasted no time. "We have a situation," he began, his voice low but unwavering. "The department is under intense scrutiny, and the mayor's office is under pressure from multiple directions. The public's anger is growing, and the city council is demanding immediate action. But here's the problem. This investigation you've launched, it's more than just a simple case of police misconduct. It's shaking the very foundations of law enforcement in this city." Alicia's eyes narrowed. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as Reed's words sunk in. "You're here to tell us to back off, aren't you?" she said, her voice low but laced with venom. Reed didn't flinch. "Not exactly. What I'm suggesting is that you and your father reconsider the direction this is taking. It's clear you want justice for what happened to you, but there are larger considerations at play here. You have no idea what you're truly up against." "What do you mean by that?" Leonard asked, his tone measured but wary. Reed looked around before leaning in closer, his voice lowering even further. "I'm talking about the bigger picture. The department has its issues, yes, but the problem goes much deeper than that. There are individuals within this city, powerful individuals, who have a vested interest in keeping this investigation from moving forward. If you continue down this path, there will be consequences that could bring the city to its knees." Alicia's mind raced. She had suspected there was more at play here, that the corrupt officers weren't operating alone. But hearing Reed's words brought that suspicion into sharp focus. It wasn't just the police force she was fighting. It was a network of power and influence that extended far beyond the department. Her fight was no longer about just exposing one officer's wrongdoings. It was about dismantling an entire system that had been built on secrecy and protection, one that was now desperately trying to protect itself from the truth. "The mayor's office is already under fire, and the police union is pushing hard to protect its own," Reed continued. "There are influential figures in this city, connected to business interests and political players, who will do whatever it takes to keep things quiet. They've seen what's happening, and they're not happy about it." Alicia felt her blood boil. "Are you telling us to stop the investigation? To let the corruption continue because it's easier for the people in power?" Reed sighed and sat back, looking at both of them with a mixture of pity and calculation. "I'm not telling you to stop, Miss Morgan, but what I am saying is that you need to think carefully about the choices you make next. The truth isn't always a luxury you can afford. And in this case, exposing that truth could cost you more than you realize." For a long moment, neither Alicia nor her father spoke. The air inside the car felt heavy with the weight of Reed's words. Alicia's mind raced, every ounce of her being wanted to fight, to expose the corruption, to bring the truth to light. But now she was being warned by someone close to the mayor, someone who had access to the very heart of the system. that she was on the brink of something far darker than she could have imagined. After what seemed like an eternity, Leonard finally spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'm not backing down. Not for anyone. Not after what I've seen. And neither is my daughter. We're not going to let this city be run by people who think they can get away with this." Reed's eyes hardened, and for the first time, Alicia saw the true weight of the situation reflected in his gaze. "I didn't expect you to back down. But I will warn you again. There are forces in play here that you're not prepared for. You think you're up against a few bad officers, but you're about to take on an entire system." Alicia's stomach twisted, but she refused to let him see the fear that crept up in her. "Let them come. I've been fighting my whole life for what's right. I'm not about to stop now." Reed nodded, seemingly resigned to the path they were choosing. "I warned you. Just remember, when this all hits the fan, don't say I didn't tell you." He opened the car door and stepped out, leaving them with a sense of foreboding that lingered in the air long after he was gone. Alicia stared out the window, her mind spinning with the weight of his words. When her father spoke, his voice was calm but heavy with the same unspoken understanding. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, but now we know what we're really up against." Alicia's hands clenched into fists. "I don't care who's involved. We can't stop now, Dad. Too many people are counting on us to expose this. We have to keep pushing." Her father's gaze softened, but his face was lined with exhaustion. "I know, and we will. But we have to be careful. They're going to come after us, Alicia. And it's not just about the police anymore. It's about everything. The whole city is built on this web of corruption." "I don't care," she said fiercely. "We've come too far to stop now. If we don't expose this, who will?" Her father nodded slowly, as if understanding that there was no turning back. The battle they had started was far from over, but the enemy they now faced was more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. As Alicia stepped out of the car and looked toward the city skyline, she felt a quiet resolve settle deep within her. The path ahead was uncertain, and the dangers were real, but she was no longer afraid of what might come. She had started this fight for justice, and no matter how dark it got, she was determined to see it through to the end. There was no turning back now. The storm had arrived, and Alicia Morgan was ready to face it head-on. The breaking point. The next few days passed in a blur of action and anticipation. The weight of the decision to press forward with the investigation, despite the mounting pressure, began to take its toll on Alicia and her father. Every decision they made, every move they took, seemed to stir the pot further, drawing the ire of those who wanted to maintain the status quo. The mayor's office, once a source of support, had turned icy. The city council was divided, and the police department, despite some efforts to reform, was starting to fracture from within. Alicia had always known that justice was a difficult fight, but as the days stretched into weeks, the emotional toll of the battle began to weigh heavily on her. It wasn't just the media blitz or the constant threats. It was the realization that exposing the corruption within the system would require more than just the fall of a few officers. It would require the dismantling of an entire culture, one that had been entrenched for decades, possibly centuries. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The messages had stopped, but the unease remained. The police union had issued a statement of support for Officer Grayson, calling the investigation into him politically motivated. The mayor had issued a tepid response, urging both sides to come together and find a resolution, but behind closed doors, it was clear that the conversation was shifting toward damage control. No one was truly interested in rooting out the rot. They just wanted the storm to pass. The media, too, had started to turn on her. Once a beacon of support, many outlets now questioned her motives. Some painted her as a hero, while others decried her as a pawn, a person too naive to realize that she was merely being used in a larger game. The accusations stung, but the one that hurt the most was the insinuation that she was somehow being manipulated by her father, that her fight wasn't her own, but rather a continuation of a legacy she hadn't truly earned. One evening, after another round of interviews, Alicia sat in her living room staring at her phone. It buzzed again. Another anonymous message. "The truth is dangerous. Morgan, you've awakened something that can't be undone. You'll be sorry you ever started this." She stared at the message for a long time, her thoughts swirling. The threats weren't just about her anymore. They were about everything she represented. She had become a symbol. To some, she was a martyr. To others, a target. But to the people in power, she was a problem. And the more she exposed, the bigger that problem became. As she scrolled through her social media feed, a sense of helplessness settled in. The messages from the public were overwhelming. Supporters sent words of encouragement, sharing stories of how her bravery had inspired them, how they saw in her the fight they had long given up on. But alongside those messages were others that chilled her to the bone. Threats of violence, photos of her home, her car, her personal information. The world she had known felt like it was closing in on her, like every move she made was being watched by those who had the power to hurt her. Her father was no different. He had become more distant, spending long hours at the office, trying to maintain control of the narrative, trying to shield Alicia from the worst of it. But the truth was, he was just as shaken as she was. They were in this together, but the toll it was taking on him was visible. His once confident, reassuring presence had turned fragile, worn thin by the weight of the decisions he had made and the pushback they had faced. Late one night, Alicia found him sitting in his office, his hands clasped tightly together on the desk, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, there was no need for words. The look in his eyes said it all. "Dad," Alicia said softly, sitting down across from him. "I know you're doing everything you can, but we can't keep doing this if it's just going to be a fight for control." Leonard sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "It's more than just control, Alicia. This is about survival. I'm not just fighting for the department or even for you. I'm fighting for the future of this city. If we can't bring change here, if we let this corruption fester, it will spread to every part of the system. And the people who have been hurt by it will never see justice." Alicia felt the weight of his words. She understood the stakes, but it didn't make it easier. "I know what this means, but I can't keep pretending this is just about doing the right thing. Every day I'm seeing the reality of how deep this goes. We've already exposed one officer. What happens when we start going after the entire system? Then we make sure it changes," Leonard replied firmly. "We can't afford to back down now, Alicia. You've already given people hope. And as much as I want to protect you from all of this, you're right. You're in this now. You're a part of something much bigger than both of us." The conversation hung in the air, neither of them knowing what the next step would be. They knew it would be dangerous, that their lives were now forever altered by their actions. But they also knew that they couldn't stop. Not now, not after everything they had learned and everything they had uncovered. But the next morning, the first sign of the impending storm came. Alicia's phone rang early, the number unfamiliar. She picked it up with a sense of dread in her chest. "Miss Morgan," the voice on the other end said, "this is Detective Ellis from the city's Internal Affairs Division. We need to speak with you." "About what?" Alicia asked, her mind already racing. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "It's about the investigation you've been pushing," Detective Ellis replied, his tone low. "There's some information we need to discuss. We've discovered something you need to know. It's bigger than you think." Alicia's stomach flipped. She knew this call was the tipping point. They had uncovered something that had the potential to change everything. "Meet me at the office," she said, her voice steady despite the growing unease. "I'll be there in an hour." The rest of the day passed in a blur. When Alicia arrived at the Internal Affairs office, the air felt charged with anticipation. Detective Ellis ushered her into a small, dimly lit room where a file sat open on the table. The detective's face was grim as he looked at her. "We've uncovered a pattern," he began, sliding the file toward her. "It's not just about Grayson or a few bad apples. This goes much deeper. There's a network of officers who've been part of a system of corruption that's been operating in the shadows for years. They've manipulated evidence, coerced witnesses, and worked to cover up their tracks. And now, the people behind it are beginning to panic. They're trying to shut this down, and they'll do anything to protect themselves. Alicia's hands trembled as she flipped through the file. The names, the dates, the connections, it was all there in black and white. She recognized some of the names, officers who had been part of the department for years, trusted figures in the community. But now, they were all linked to a network of corruption that was so vast, it was almost impossible to comprehend. As she absorbed the information, Alicia realized the depth of the battle she was facing. This was no longer just about police brutality or racial profiling. This was about an entrenched system of power, greed, and manipulation that reached into every corner of the city's infrastructure. She looked up at Detective Ellis, her mind racing. How many people are involved? Ellis's face hardened. Too many. And it goes beyond the police force. There are politicians, business leaders, even members of the media. This isn't just a department issue. It's a citywide issue. Alicia's heart sank. This was bigger than she could have ever imagined. But as she stared at the file, she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. They had opened Pandora's box, and the only way to close it was to tear the system down completely. But with every revelation came greater danger. The battle ahead would test everything Alicia had, her strength, her resolve, and her very survival. This was the moment of truth.